All right, Kinesiology 230. This is still chapter 21. Still talking about clients with orthopedic injury uh, or rehabilitation concerns. And with this, we're talking about the shoulder in presentation 3. And I can tell you, while it starts on 572 and it ends a couple pages later, much like the low back, this cannot be, there's no way it could possibly be fully exhaustive because there's going to be so many different conditions that you come across. But we'll hit on and have a highlight of a few of them. But again, it's one of those where, because it's such a complex area of the body, you can't fully exhaust everything regarding the shoulder. All right, so the book seems to pull a ton of content from a specific part of the chapter. I'm going to really do my best to try to keep this at a minimum and not overwhelm you with a bunch of stuff in the book. If you want to read more, you can. But I will tell you this, as I just stated, the shoulder itself is incredibly mobile. It makes it very articulate. And as a result, it's also very susceptible to injury. So the shoulder itself, they note in the book that the anatomy of the shoulder allows for great mobility of the joint, but can also make it more susceptible to injury, whether acute, traumatic, atraumatic, chronic, or overuse. So in the shoulder, it's necessary to consider posture, muscular balance, and I'm reading as well as they're listed over here, scapular thoracic control, range of motion, and even the relationship to trunk and hip for the joint to perform as a highly synchronous and balanced complex. And by that, they're meaning it's not a typo. It's a complex, right, between the shoulder blade and the humerus. There's a co-articulation there, so you have multiple co-contractions that happen. So it's inherently complex, but it is the shoulder complex itself. And I will say this, you have the shoulder blade that has to work in harmony with the humerus and the clavicle to a certain degree, but there's a number of different muscles that all affect that, make that happen. And they also note that the trunk and the hips are vital to shoulder function. The legs and trunk provide 51 to 55% of total kinetic energy and total force for overhead activities. With this, I talk a lot in my other classes in terms of athletic movement and how we talk about a transferability of force across the actual entire kinetic chain, meaning the entire series of muscles in the body to be able to throw a baseball. It's not just the shoulder and the arm. It is literally from top to bottom. You can look at every single muscle from the big toe of the left foot all the way up, across my torso, across my chest, into my right shoulder, into my right arm, and the muscles in my forearm to be able to hold on to the ball as I throw the ball. So you have a very, very high degree of coordinated movement, but the amount of force that's created has to transfer through the body. And if you have a weaker joint, perhaps, if we go just for example, hip joint to shoulder joint, and that force is being generated by the hip joint and transferred through the shoulder joint. Now, granted, you have some loss of force production as it crosses through the body, but because of the syncopated nature of the contraction and the force coupling that you have from muscle to muscle to muscle as you articulate all these different joints, the result is you have a huge amount of force that's actually going across the shoulder joint, and you also have a sizable amount of angular velocity that's happening as you're rotating the shoulder through two basic planes of movement to throw that ball, even though it's multiplanular. So long story short, I'll get out of my sidebar. Just realize that these are two things you might want to commit to memory. But if you're doing an overhead activity, let's even just say you're doing a push press, you think push press is the shoulders or are the shoulders. In actuality, you're generating force by delivering force into the ground, getting an equal opposite reaction out of the ground from the hips and the glutes. And then it's transferred up through the body and through the kinetic chain to the shoulders to snap that bar overhead. So it's not like it's just shoulders, right? Now, there's a number of different muscle imbalances that can contribute to shoulder injuries if a person's kyphotic and they're rounded over. And this is very common. We see this all the time. And if you you get into training, you're going to have tons of people who come in that you work with and they sit in front of a computer all day, or they're staring at their phone all day in a head down position. So as the best way I always describe this is, if you're standing there looking at your phone, you're casting your gaze on your phone in your hand. Well, your eyes are down, so your head goes down. Your head goes down, you start to slouch and round the shoulders over. As soon as you do that, the domino effect is it changes the position of the thoracic area, because the cervical area changes, the thoracic area changes, and it changes the lumbar area. And so you have this kind of multiple articulation process that happens down the spinal column because you're just staring down at your phone. Same thing with people who are sitting at their desk all day. They're sitting at their desk all day and they're kind of bringing their head forward. They're staring at the computer screen. They're kind of looking at the content. They're typing. And they're typing on a keyboard that forces their hands inward, which is internal rotation, which exacerbates that rounded process in the shoulders. And probably many of you are doing it right now as you're watching this video. But my point to this is, and the book points out that with the rounded shoulders and the kyphotic posture, which is where we live 8 hours a day almost as students and in the workforce, they create these very common injuries, and they're causing this internal rotation of the humerus, protracted shoulder blades, weakness of the posterior aspect, the scapular retractors and the lateral retractors are weak, and you have this tightness of the anterior aspect, meaning like the pecs up front. Well, this can really cause your shoulder blades to almost like become stuck in the thoracic region. Subscap, the job of subscap is to help articulate the shoulder blade back and forth. Same thing with the rhomboids, they help articulate the shoulder blades back and forth, kind of in and out. You also have, as you raise the arms above your head, you have this co-articulation. The arms go up, the shoulder blades actually have the lower border rotates outward. So there's a number of different things that happen when we work, when we move our arms and when we actually sit properly. But unfortunately, we're stuck in activities of daily living that take us completely out of the ability to really have any kind of articulation in the actual shoulder complex. So the balance that you have to have between anterior and posterior and internal and external rotation is kind of key to proper function and injury prevention. And I will tell you, when you have people come in who sit all day in this kind of rounded over, hunched over position, and they're typing on their keyboard, when you bring them in, one of the first things you probably shouldn't do is push-ups and bench press, because you're shortening everything up front that's already short. You almost have to get them on a physio ball laying backwards and just open up their chest and allow their chest to spread to work them up. Okay, on to the next one. There we go. So the muscle imbalances can contribute to shoulder injuries by affecting the force couples within the joint. In the GH joint, the external rotators form a force couple with the internal rotators, and the rotator cuff with the deltoid. If any of those are out of balance, that dysfunction can cause problems in the shoulder joint. Now, individuals who have greater muscle imbalances are more likely to experience subacromial impingement syndrome and shoulder pain. Then further down, the GH and scapulothoracic muscles act collectively to provide a synchronous and consistent relationship to produce shoulder movement. Now, I highlight these because the book itself makes it a point to reflect upon these later on. But I will tell you, each one of these is categorically correct. I agree with them completely. And it's a matter of having that balance between the different muscle groups in the shoulder joint to have proper functioning. Now, granted, anytime we contract a muscle on one side, there has to be flexibility on the other side to make that happen, or at least allow that to happen. And so often when we're seated all day long, we have this imbalance that manifests in terms of we're super flexible on one side of our body, and we really don't work out all that much, so there's not a lot of muscle tone going on. So what do you need to do when you start to work with the person who walks in who's all kyphotic and rounded over? You need to get them out of kyphosis. You got to get them to the point where you open up the chest and spread the chest open. And the idea is, at least from the book standpoint, to help your clients not end up with something like subacromial impingement syndrome. It's a pinching of a supraspinatus. Well, here I'll describe it all the way out there as I have it written. It's a pinching of a supraspinatus, the long head of the biceps tendon, or the subacromial bursa under the acromial arch. So here's a couple things going on, right? So you have the biceps tendon, long head. That tendon comes up. There's a bicipital groove here, and that can become inflamed. Also, supraspinatus, there's your spine of the scapula right here. So supraspinatus, supra, above, spinatus, so above the spine. Subscapularis, that's underneath the spine. But supraspinatus, above the spine, you have the muscle comes out and attaches out here on the humerus. Now that is used in roughly about, it's used a little bit in external rotation, but it's used also in about the first 15 degrees of abduction. So oftentimes people kind of pound on this little guy doing side raises, trying to work delts, but it gets absolutely beat up during the first 15 degrees of movement. So you may have to move your clients around and change your body position so you're not activating supraspinatus so much. All right. Next, they talk about factors that may be altered include muscle imbalances, poor posture, scapular control, and improvement and improper exercise technique or overuse of the shoulder, typically overhead. Now, baseball pitchers and swimmers, because of what they do over and over and over again, they're beating up on their shoulder. So, you have to find ways to bring the inflammation down so you don't end up with the impingement syndrome in the shoulder. Now, the other muscles that are attached to the scapula, primarily upper and lower traps, serratus anterior, levator scapulae, in some regard, you look at what they do anatomically, rotate the scapula during overhead movements, which when any of these muscles become weak or fail to function properly, you may have subacromial impingement syndrome. So when they're talking about subacromial impingement syndrome for this, what they're talking about is the acromion process right here. And you have this bursa that's underneath the acromion. And because of inflammation, you have a swelling in this area because it's pretty tight. It's not like you have a lot of space in there. That gets pretty tight, and a little bit of inflammation causes that pressure against the acromion process, and that's what causes the subacromial impingement syndrome. Now, the big thing you have with that is it's going to be rest, rest, rest. But if we look at different exercise guidelines here, they have some do's and don'ts for shoulder exercises. Subacromial impingement syndrome, you're not going to do overhead or painful movements. The contraindications are shoulder press, exercise things that are indicated, you can do will be rotator cuff strengthening, pain-free exercises, posterior shoulder. I would also say you're probably going to work a lot on inferior border of a scapula type work, scapular depression with bands, work on things to do the exact opposite of what would irritate or cause the impingement syndrome. If we look at this, one of these specific to behind the neck, pull down the shoulder and press, that is a question later on. So when you have this shoulder instability, one of the contraindications is to not do behind the neck lat pull down or behind the neck shoulder press. Just remember that for later on. Whoops, sorry, get that little box on there so it helps remind you. All right, GH joint. Anterior instability, movement exercise guidelines. The book offers several suggestions on this regarding to activities. This is on 577. Once a client has completed treatment for an unstable shoulder, most aerobic training activities are good to go, with the exception of some aerobic dance steps, swimming, specifically freestyle, backstroke, and butterfly, and racket sports. So you have to know this on a test question, and I'm trying to remember if I just left the test question out because it just irritated me so much. Because you'd have to know the different strokes for swimming. You have to know there's freestyle, backstroke, butterfly, and there's one more. I'll give you a second. It's called the breaststroke. And the list here is, or are, the 3 of the 4 that are contraindicated and you shouldn't do. But somehow you are to know, presumably you're all swimmers, you are to know that the breaststroke is good to go for that exercise, or for somebody who had GH joint anterior instability. So I think it's a little bit of trickery on the book, and I don't like it, but I just want to point that out. If you see a question that talks specifically about swimming and GH joint anterior instability, realize these three are contraindicated, and you'd end up doing the breaststroke. All right, tricky, tricky. With the rotator cuff muscles, I do hope you know these by this point. If you're in a 200 level course and you're learning this stuff now, you're probably a little bit late to the party, right? Because this is stuff that should have been learned a little bit ago. But you have subscapularis. This is a right arm rendering. If we took the rib cage and the thoracic area out of the way, this is the underside of the scapula, so subscapularis, under the scapula. Infraspinatus, so remember that I mentioned you have the spine of the scapula. The infraspinatus is beneath that. The subscapula, the supraspinatus is above that, and the supraspinatus comes out and attaches out here in the humerus, as we talked about. If we look at this from the back side, you have, here's the spine of the scapula, and beneath or under the spine of the scapula would be infraspinatus. Above the spine would be supraspinatus, and that's the one where the supraspinatus comes out and attaches out here on the humerus. It's about the first 15 degrees of abduction. And you have teres minor. So your four muscles are supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis, and teres minor. If you rearrange the letters instead of S-I-S-T, you'll oftentimes see this written as S-I-T-S. SITS is a way to remember that as an acronym. And the supraspinatus is usually one that's most often torn. All right, guys, signing off.